I've got the really terrible slot where everyone's desperate for lunch and you're starting to fade. So I'm going to do my best to keep you awake and run through it quickly. Knowing me, I always talk over. So if I miss having time for questions, I'm happy to talk to people during lunch. I'm always okay with that. So earlier today, John Brown mentioned in his introduction that disabled children, including children with autism, are more likely to be victims of abuse and neglect than children who don't have disabilities. And I think my first thought when I hear that statistic is probably the same as yours. Why? Why should children who are the most vulnerable be vulnerable even further? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about reasons that we sometimes miss the signs or ignore the signs of abuse and neglect in children with autism, and also ways that we sometimes get it completely wrong, because I know so many parents who've been in his shoes, including me. Many of us have been there. I won't read off my slides. If I did, we'll never get through them. But these are some of the key reasons that people with disabilities, children or adults, can be more vulnerable to abuse. They don't have that protective social network that typical children have. They have fewer social contacts. There are fewer people keeping an eye open for what happens to them. They have fewer friends to talk to about things that might be wrong at home. And it also leaves them open to people who might be not friends. Because if you don't have any friends and someone comes to you and says, I'd like to be your friend, you're far more likely to trust that person because you desperately want friends. And I see lots of people nodding heads who know people who've been in this situation. They are dependent on others for vital needs. Whenever you're dependent on other people, if those people are trustworthy, great, fantastic. But if you're dependent on someone who is not trustworthy or who is just not quite capable of meeting your needs, that instantly puts you in a vulnerable position. We have a lack of access to remedies for abuse and neglect, because once you're in sort of the disability system, you can find that you don't have access to other things. Everything is around your disability. And whoever you talk to, the professionals you see, that's their expertise. You may not be able to access the services that you need. You may not be able to get support for other areas of your life because that's not part of supporting people with autism. You won't be perhaps referred to someone to help you with marriage counseling or violence prevention in the home. You're almost afraid to even talk about it if you're the parent and you're concerned about other issues because you're worried that these kind of situations that have just been discussed will be what the result is. There's a social acceptability of low standards for care. There just is. It's unfortunate. This is something that's in our culture, that we just don't have the same standards for people with disability that we do for others. And there's a social acceptability of domestic abuse. I mean, I've been invited to abuse my child. My son, Lynn knows him. He's an interesting boy. He finished his degree, Lynn, with a 2.1. But this is a child who's very large and who often was a problem in public. And if I had, $100 for every time someone said, you need to give that boy a slap, I'd be a rich lady. And he did work my nerves on many occasions, but I held myself back. Not everyone can, and many people find themselves under very strong social pressure to use methods of control that are abusive, but they're being told the message by people around them that this is the right thing to do, this is what they should do. And there's a power dynamic, especially in institutional care. We've seen this in Winterbourne View, of course, but it's certainly not limited to there, where controlling personalities and bad methodology can kind of become embedded in what we do with people. And once it's in the system, it's really hard to say anything about it. I'll add to this social isolation. The further away a person is from the people who love them and really permanently care about them, the more at risk they are. This is one of the things that's been coming out in the Laughing Boy Bill process. If anyone wants to talk to me about that, I'll be glad to tell you. This is about adults with disabilities primarily who are being placed far away from their families, and that's definitely a risk factor because you're not seeing what goes on every day. The more you see, just like when you have a parent in a nursing home, the more times you're in, the safer they are. It's the same with our kids. And of course, children are more dependent than the most vulnerable adults. And if you have a communication problem, that introduces an additional level of vulnerability. So you have a perfect storm with kids with autism. They have all of these criteria. Now, there are multiple factors that can prevent people from recognizing the signs of abuse and neglect. Some of these are to do with autism, and our earlier presenter went through some of those, so I'm going to skim through that bit. Communication difficulties mean they might not be able to tell us. There are some dangerous assumptions about autism and people with autism that can increase their risk. We make excuses. I'll talk about a few of those. And the pressures on parents. And as a parent myself, and as an American parent, I've been through all of that. And I can speak to it with some authority of how difficult it is to deal with those outside pressures. The autism-specific factors, I want to make it clear, these aren't things that are wrong with people who have autism. They're just things that are different, but they're different than what we're used to. So we're expecting a certain kind of communication. We're expecting people to understand, and if they don't, we kind of forget to turn that around, that we're supposed to provide the service that interprets for them, that assists them to understand what's going on. If we just expect them to get on with it in a neurotypical world, they're quite open to difficult things happening and not being able to tell anyone about it in an effective way. They also can really struggle in the environments that we create for them. We create environments that are actually quite hostile sometimes, and then we're surprised that they behave in ways that show that they're distressed, and we punish the distress. This is a problem. We do it as parents too. One of the things that bothers me the most, the criteria for autism, they still haven't included sensory perceptual differences in the core criteria, but if you talk to people with autism, they'll tell you that is what bothers them the most. And yet we persist in creating environments that are distressing to people with sensory perceptual differences and expecting people to function in these for long periods of time. I actually think that's abusive. My partner's on the spectrum, and talk to him about his school experiences of being forced to sit in a fluorescently lit room for 8 hours a day in his seat, doing things he didn't understand, and trying to communicate with people who didn't understand his communication. That didn't feel very good. It was very emotionally distressing. And then to come home and have your parents not be on your side, but say, there's something wrong with you, kid. He didn't have a diagnosis back then, You just need to get with it. There's something wrong with you, if you can't handle the way that school is. And it changes how you feel about yourself, those kinds of experiences, I think. Coping with disruption to routine. Well, who's disrupting the routine? That would be us. Coping with disruption that hasn't been telegraphed in advance and prepared for and supported. We don't mean it to be abusive, but that's how it feels from the inside, from the person themselves. And then we punish the result. And knowing when authority is being abused, I do a fair bit of expert witness work these days, and I've had a number of cases where that really is the core issue. We have an awful lot of kids with disabilities of various sorts, where the first thing that is our priority is to teach them to behave, to follow directions from authority figures. We even have methods in autism where that is the core principle of the method, to teach compliance. And we'll spend a lot of time teaching compliance. Now that's fine with teaching compliance with doing a school task, but we forget that it has a knock-on effect, especially for people who struggle to understand different kinds of behavior in different settings, is what we get with typically developing kids. Kids with autism will tend to learn one way to do it, and then they'll just do that all the time. So we can be setting people up for very difficult situations where we've taught someone to do what they're told, and then someone who's not a nice person tells them to do something, like have sex with them. And I've seen it happen, and I've seen the consequences. So it's one we've got to really think about. I really appreciated what Robin had to say about that, about encouraging children to learn how to talk back to professionals. Now, my son never had a problem with that. Quite the opposite. But maybe that's because I'm not the kind of person who really, goes with authority either. But if I'd listened to all the teachers, I would have, really taught him in that direction. We have an awful lot of kids still who don't have a good working means of communication. And there's a few factors in that, which I'll talk about. But if you don't have a way to communicate things that are happening, you are extremely vulnerable to things going wrong because you can't tell anyone when it's happening. But communication isn't just about you having a way to communicate. It's about other people listening. It's a two-way street. So we do have cases where kids are trying to tell us, and they're trying to tell us with their behavior. They're trying to tell us with words sometimes, but we're not taking their words seriously. We're not listening really. We're not looking for patterns. We're not paying attention. And it goes on, and they begin to think, well, either nobody cares or what's going on is okay. What's going on here is fine. When communication is idiosyncratic and someone does see a professional, the natural thing to do is ask the parent, what does he mean? Now, most parents are fantastic. Well, we're doing the right thing, but we do know that there are some who are abusive. And if we're asking that parent, what does he mean when he does this, and the parent kind of knows what's going on and says, oh, it just means he's distressed, and we say, oh, yeah, well, that's fine, we can miss something that's really important that the young person's trying to tell us because we haven't taken the time to get to know him. We're just taking someone else's word for it, and it can happen both ways. I know parents who have children in residential school who've seen new behaviors. When their child comes home, they call the school, and the school says, oh, yeah, he started doing that lately when he's distressed. It doesn't really mean anything. It just means he's upset. Well, actually, it's a change, and it probably does mean something that we need to pay attention to. We've got some assumptions about autism that I think really put people at greater risk, and I work with staff a lot. That's mainly what I've done for the last 10 years or so. I've trained a lot of staff, and I've heard all of these, including from people who are really well-meaning and who just need a little bit more education. They'll get it right. Things like assistive and augmentative communication, things like PECS cards or AAC devices will keep people from developing verbal speech, so we're not going to use them. Yeah, a couple of you are laughing, but it's not funny if it's your kid. It's exactly the opposite. It's completely the opposite. The more tools you give someone to communicate with, the more likely they are to develop communication on every front. But I have known of people who've been denied that opportunity because if we just push a little more, he's got a few words, he's capable of talking, we're just going to push. But he can't communicate with you in the meantime, and he may never develop that ability because we can't predict. Also, when people are distressed, they need something to fall back on. I know some very articulate, very able adults with autism who, when they're stressed and distressed, lose their ability to use verbal speech, and they need something that they can use when they're in that situation. So I think this stuff is crucial. All people should have access to more than one way to communicate. I've had teachers tell me, oh, it's just echolalia, or it's just script from EastEnders, and it doesn't mean anything. But it probably does mean something. It may not be literal. If he says, just kill me, that could be a line from a movie. It may not mean exactly that. But it might have an implication for him. So we need to find out, when does he use that little phrase, and does it have a meaning for him? Don't take it literally, but understand that it can have purpose. Even echolalia can have purpose. And I know the literature, which I've seen for speech therapists, sometimes still says it's meaningless repetition. It is not always meaningless. It can mean someone's distressed, and that's an important meaning. That people have challenging behavior, the way that they have measles. It's just a thing that you have. That people have self-injury. I often see this in reports. Julie is a 10-year-old child with autism and self-injury, as though it's an extra diagnosis. No, it's a means of communication, of communicating distress to the self, if not necessarily to anyone else. It's not meaningless. And we need to try to interpret that meaning by getting to know the child. We can't just guess from a textbook or from other people's descriptions what it means. We need to know what it means to them. And that takes time, and time is something many professionals say they don't have, although they got a lot of time to go to meetings. I have noticed that. That families of autistic children are a pain in the ass. We are. And that means we don't need to listen to them. See, the first part is true. We are a pain, and I am a royal pain. Hopefully there's no one here who's been on the receiving end, or you'd be running. But there's a reason I'm a pain. It's because I really love my son, and I want him to get on in life. And if I'm seeming to come across in a way that's obnoxious, it's probably because you're not listening to me, or the last guy didn't listen to me, and you're getting it. It's not your fault. Maybe it was that other guy. But I want to communicate with you, and I want things to go well between us. I want what's best for my lad. But we also have the converse. Parents have gotten the message that professionals have gotten the message of parents as experts, and yes, we are. But sometimes we're wrong. And we need permission to be wrong, and we need to be able to talk with you about it without being penalized for being wrong. It should be collegial with parents. Don't be afraid to tell us that we're wrong if you have really, really good evidence for us being wrong about something, and we can talk about it from a position of respect. That's a hard position to come to. You often have had multiple experiences as a parent of not being respected, not being listened to, and so you automatically are defensive and automatically are insistent, my way or the highway. Same with professionals. So we need to have a little more humility with each other and put the child at the center instead of our interaction, because often it becomes all about our interaction and our argument and our problem, and the child is over here. And he's the one who's in need of support. There are some more assumptions, and these can lead to abuse and neglect. Belief that anything is okay to do to autistic people because being autistic is terrible. This is the American way these days, as you may know. You can give people any drug. You can give them drugs that cause neurodevelopmental harm, drugs that have not been tested. You can put them on a special diet. That's not so bad, but I've seen some pretty crazy special diets. You can do any kind of therapy. You can put bleach up their backside. You can do all kinds of crazy things because being autistic is so, so terrible that you almost must do these awful things to your child, because otherwise, as one speaker said at a conference I went to some years back, if I don't do these things, my son will be rocking in a corner in an institution. And I wanted to say, you do know we close the institutions down. Those don't exist. He won't be going to the big mental hospital. Do you know any adults with autism? Yeah? Do you know what their lives are like? Do you know that some people's lives are really blighted by choices that parents made under pressure from people from outside the family who are telling them, you must do these things because otherwise he's going to have an awful life. But meanwhile, he's having an awful life while you're doing these things. And that has a long-term impact as well. Belief that children can act normal if they just try hard enough. How many people have heard this one from a colleague or professional? Yeah, there's a few. And we all know someone we've worked with who said, I've seen him act okay. He only does it when he's in your class. He acts out like that. Or, at his old school, it says he was fine, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't work that way. Belief that children don't understand what's said in front of them. And I remember well, because he doesn't speak, so he doesn't understand. Misunderstanding of receptive and expressive speech. Anyone who's seen that incredibly awful film, Autism Every Day, that Autism Speaks did, where a mother's talking about how stressed she is and she wants to drive off the bridge with her child someday, and the child's sitting there. I mean, that is shocking, absolutely shocking, but I've seen it before, where professionals are saying things about children or assuming that things they send home about a child will only be read by the parent. My son opened the envelope one day before I did, and it was his school report. I wonder why he wanted to open that before I saw it, yeah? Because he knew there were going to be things in it that weren't very nice, and I came home about 10 minutes later. I'd just been around the corner to the shop, and he was in tears because there was a letter from a teacher saying, I can't see this child ever achieving even a certificate of completion, much less a GCSE. He should be in special school. And it was devastating, and he still carries this around with him. I think he probably feels that he's proved himself at this point, because he did manage to finish school, did manage to finish university. But to think that a child isn't going to see that, that's not a very nice message, even to me as a parent. I mean, I was fuming angry because I knew it wasn't true. But don't assume children won't see what you write. And that is emotionally abusive, to be told you can't achieve, that you're not worth putting resources into, and kids do get these messages quite often. Belief that autistic children don't feel pain. This is still in the bloody literature, that they have unusual pain perception. It's said in all kinds of ways. What they have is unusual pain communication. Pain is a sign that your body is being injured. If you don't interpret that message that your body is being injured, it doesn't mean that you're not being injured. It means that we need to take more time to make sure you don't get injured, because you might not notice until you've actually been injured. It's a very different thing, but I still see it in the literature quite often in rather badly designed autism awareness sessions and that kind of thing. So watch out for that message, because it's out there. I've seen it in the context of manual handling training as well. Don't worry about what you do, because they don't feel pain in the normal way anyway. That's really wretched. Oh no. But belief that autism is caused by demonic possession or witchcraft, yep, that one's still out there. And the idea that it doesn't matter who works in a service, that's a real problem. We know that we've got a problem in recruitment in a lot of services, that it's hard to just get people who will show up and do the job, but we also know some of the people who are showing up to do the job are not very trustworthy, and that people aren't listened to when they're telling that things have gone wrong. And this is a real person. She's put this photo on the internet as part of a project to encourage women to talk up about sexual abuse. This is something that happened to her with a teacher over a long period of time, and she wasn't believed. And we do know that predators seek to work with these kids. The other thing is that predatory abusers cover up for each other. And one of the things that's coming out with the Cyril Smith case, the guy who was an MP who was abusing kids in care up north, is that he got friends hired, and that his friends then got friends hired. And the result is a lot of very blighted lives of kids in care, some of whom were on the autism spectrum. This is a tough one for staff. We know that the system stinks. We know that sometimes if we flag up concerns, the result might not be a solution, it might be a bigger problem. We know that there are a lot of parents who are really on the edge and barely handling it, but is it really a good idea to report them to social services? Will social services come in with help? See, I was one of those parents who believed that if I went to social services and asked for help, that's what they do, right? Because I'd never, I kind of came from a background where, my mom knew social workers and they're all really nice ladies. And I thought, oh yeah, they help kids. And actually, that's not our experience. We thought they might have a behavior service that would help us. My son ended up on the Child Protection Register, and there was no help. There was just suspicion and difficulty, and things got tough. But it's the same with staff. When we know that things are not going well with staff, somebody's not pulling their weight, they aren't well trained, that kind of thing, do we pull it up? Do we go to the Care Quality Commission? Do we say something to the head? What's going to happen? They might just get fired, and then we don't have anyone at all. The solution is to change the system, to make sure people get trained, to make sure people are properly supported. But in the meantime, we all find ourselves juggling, and that's hard. And I do want to mention pressures on parents. I probably won't get to finish because we're going to run out of time, but parents are facing additional pressures on top of the pressure that they already experience from trying to do a great job parenting their child. These pressures come from outside. They come from people who want to sell you things, and one of the ways things get sold is by using parents to front marketing campaigns. It's been going on in disability for years, but in autism, it's particularly difficult. And I've watched it happen with a number of very dodgy methodologies and treatments over the years. I could give you examples. I'll try not to mention anything by name. Sort of guilt trips. If you're not doing this, you're not doing enough. Parents in the US will talk about the parent who just does what the school tells them to do, or the parent who's an autism hero. Well, the problem with being a hero is that what do heroes do? Heroes take heroic measures. And, heroic measures are doing sometimes barmy things that are almost more about the parent feeling that they're doing what they should do than about the child's needs. And parents can egg each other on through web forums and things like that. I'm doing this and this and this. How come you're just doing that? That's not enough. You've got to do more. And sometimes there's a real marketing push, and we think we're talking to a parent, but we're actually talking to someone who has something to sell. And it's really hard to know which is which. I've even seen cases where it was literal fraud, where someone made up fake parents who then joined a parent support forum, and this therapy really worked great for me. And then we found out they weren't real people. They were, I think they call them sock puppets. Yeah? Have you heard this phrase before? It's when you make up a fake identity to talk about stuff. How would you know as a parent? You're hearing this fantastic method. It really works great. And it turns out you're being lied to by a marketer posing as a parent. But we also have pressure on parents to market. And parents have been used to deflect attention from abusive school-based programs on a couple of occasions. Boston Higashi School, that one's well known, kids are being hit. And parents were marshaled to defend the school. They were told that, if we're shut down, then your kid's going to lose his place and he's going to regress and it's going to be terrible. They did some good things at Higashi too, so I can see why parents wanted to, keep that place. But it doesn't make them immune to criticism. They needed to change what they were doing. But the parents were pulled into the system, and to the detriment of the kids, who continued to be hit for quite a long time. When the cure doesn't happen, and it doesn't, because I haven't met any cured autistic people yet, and I've been in this game a long time, I meet lots of well-adjusted, fantastic adults who still have autism, which is fine by me. But when that cure that's promised doesn't happen, that is a real danger point. And those of us who've done work around child protection know this, that this is a point. The lady who jumped off the bridge in Sunderland, that was her point. She'd done all the things that she thought she needed to do, and instead things are getting worse because he was in puberty. It's never going to get better. Okay, I'm just going to, we're both going to die, and that'll be the solution. So always watch for that point when you're dealing with parents, when they're at the end of their tether, they've done everything. That's when they need extra support to refocus on another kind of good future, a different kind of good future. I'm going to leave these slides through because, as usual, I've overspoke. I'm going to go straight to the end because these are there. You can read them later and use these in your service, I hope. And since this adds right on, and I think it applies to staff as well, one of the best protective measures we have against abuse, especially abuse where it's disguised as therapy or treatment, is to get to know adults with autism who have good lives. This made the difference for me. I've seen it make a difference for other parents. To see the things that are possible, the things that are good, that you can have a life that is a fantastic life, an enviable life is a word that's gotten used in learning difficulties. A life that you're like, I really want my kid to have that life. It might be different than the one you'd planned, the one you planned when you thought you had a kid who's a typical kid. But it's a life that's acceptable and okay, and you can, that'll be all right for him. Get to know young adults, get to know middle-aged adults, get to know some old people with autism, and realize that they've had lives where they've contributed, where they've remained parts of their family, where they're in the community, they might be working, they've finished education. You get to know that the life trajectory doesn't end at 16. One of the fantastic things about autism is that the brain keeps developing. Most of us stop at 18 or so, maybe even go backwards in a few cases. People with autism that I know are still passionate about learning when they get older. at 30 or 40, at 50 even. You see massive development in their interests, new interests, learning a language, any kind of thing, because they don't have that social expectation that, okay, school time's done. I don't have to change. I don't need to grow. And maybe there's even something different about the way the brain's development. The pruning process also is different. And there's a potential for development there that doesn't end in the teen years. For parents to see that gives us some relief. It keeps us from doing things that might not be good. Same with staff. If they've got the idea that the only hope for these kids is that they're going to go into the special system, to find out about the real alternatives for adult lives, living in the community, independent living, what kind of support could be available or is available, it changes what we do as staff and as parents. I'll leave you with that, but I'm happy to take a couple questions, and I'm happy to talk to people during the break. I have to talk to someone else first, but you can come find me if you've got a personal question. And I think that's it.
Mitzi,
I better stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you.